He didn't come to impress anyone. He came because he made a promise to a woman who couldn't keep hers, the woman who died before she ever got to watch their daughter grow up. But the moment Ethan Carter walked through those doors with his 7-year-old girl in her best dress, the room looked at him like he was a stain on the carpet. Security grabbed his arm in front of everyone. The music kept playing, the chandeliers kept glowing, and every polished, decorated guest in that ballroom turned to watch. Sophie saw all of it, and that was the moment everything began to unravel. If this story moves you, hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The invitation had been sitting on Ethan's kitchen counter for 11 days before he finally picked it up and read it properly. It was printed on thick cream stock, the kind that felt deliberate in your hand, like whoever sent it wanted you to understand, from the texture alone, that this was not something you threw away. The gold seal at the top read, Annual Veterans Honor Gala, Fort Meridian Military Foundation. Below that, in smaller but no less serious type, in honored recognition of those who served and those who carry their memory forward. He'd read it 3 times that first evening and then set it face down on the counter, like flipping it over would somehow make the decision easier. It didn't. The truth was, Ethan Carter wasn't sure he belonged anywhere near that building. He hadn't spoken at a military function in 4 years. He hadn't worn anything with insignia in longer than that. He drove a second-hand pickup truck, worked maintenance shifts at a mid-sized logistics warehouse on the edge of town, and spent the better part of his evenings helping his daughter, Sophie, with her second-grade reading assignments and making sure she actually brushed her teeth before bed. That was the shape of his life now. Small and steady and, on the good days, almost enough. The gala was not part of that shape, but on the night he finally read the invitation straight through, he'd been sitting in the hallway outside Sophie's room, listening to her sleep the way he still sometimes did, a habit left over from the first months after Claire died, when every small sound she made felt like something he needed to account for. And he'd thought about Claire, about the conversation they'd had, the last real one, before everything came apart. "Promise me you'll take her," Claire had said. She was still in the hospital then, still fighting, still telling people she planned to be fine, when she's old enough to understand what her mother stood for. "Promise me you'll make sure she knows." He'd promised. Of course he'd promised. You don't say no to someone you love when she's asking you to carry something forward for her. The problem was that understanding something and being ready to face it were 2 different things. Sophie was 7 now, old enough to start asking real questions about her mother, old enough to look at the framed photo on the mantel and want more than a photograph. And Ethan had been telling himself for 3 years that he'd know when the time was right. He picked up the invitation again. Read the date. Maybe this was it. Maybe there was no right, just the next step you either took or didn't. He put it in the kitchen drawer beside the batteries and the takeout menus. Then he took it out again 20 minutes later. Getting Sophie ready that evening was its own complicated event. She had opinions about her dress. She always had opinions. And the blue one Ethan had bought for the occasion was, according to Sophie, too scratchy at the neck, which led to 15 minutes of negotiation and a compromise involving the addition of a soft undershirt that made her look slightly like a small, overdressed sailor. She wore her dark hair in 2 braids that Ethan had practiced for 3 days prior, watching tutorial videos at the kitchen table after she went to sleep. They weren't perfect. The left one sat a little lower than the right, but Sophie looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and said, very seriously, "Daddy, I look fancy." And Ethan said, "Yeah, baby, you really do." And he meant it more than she knew. In the truck, on the way to the venue, Sophie pressed her face to the passenger window and watched the city go by. "Will Mommy's name be there?" she asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "There's a wall with names on it." "Yeah." "Can I touch it?" "We'll see." "That means yes," Sophie said matter-of-factly, because she had already learned how to decode him. He almost smiled. "It means we'll see." She seemed satisfied with that and went back to watching the lights. After a minute, she said, "Does it say her whole name? Or just her last name?" "Both." "Good," Sophie said. "She deserves both." Ethan's throat tightened. He said nothing, just reached over and briefly covered her small knee with his hand, and she let him, which she didn't always. The Fort Meridian Military Foundation Gala was held at the Alderman Grand, one of those old downtown venues that had been hosting important evenings for so long. It had developed a kind of institutional gravity. You could feel it in the lobby, in the width of the marble floors and the weight of the chandeliers, in the way the staff moved with quiet, practiced efficiency, as if even they understood they were part of a production. The front of the building was lined with black town cars. Men in dark suits stood in clusters on the steps, talking in the low, comfortable tones of people who knew they were supposed to be there. Women in formal gowns moved through the front doors in pairs. Ethan pulled the pickup into valet and watched the attendant blink at the truck for just a fraction of a second before composing himself. He climbed out, went around to Sophie's side, and helped her down. "Big building," Sophie observed. "Yeah. Bigger than our building. Much bigger." "Okay." She slid her hand into his, and they walked toward the entrance. The lobby opened into a wide reception hall, softly lit and loud in the way that money tends to make things loud. Not obnoxious, but dense. The noise of too many confident voices in too beautiful a space. There was a string quartet somewhere near the far wall, though you could only hear it between the waves of conversation. Waitstaff circulated with trays. The whole room smelled like expensive flowers. Ethan reached the check-in table and presented the invitation. The woman behind the table took it, looked at her screen, and then looked up at him in a way that was just enough to make him register that something was wrong. "I'm sorry," she said. "This name isn't appearing in our guest registration." Ethan kept his voice even. "Ethan Carter. It should be under that." She typed again, slower. There's a Carter listed, but the registration shows an Ethan Carter who was confirmed deceased." She paused on that word. Awkward now. "There may have been an administrative error." "I'm not deceased," Ethan said. "No, I can see that." She typed something else. "I'll just need to call our coordinator if you can wait just a moment." "Is everything all right?" A man in a dark blazer had appeared beside the table. He had the look of someone whose entire professional purpose was to handle exactly this kind of situation. Slightly larger than he needed to be, standing with his feet just wider than his shoulders. Security. Not uniformed, but unmistakable. "There's a registration issue," the check-in woman explained quietly. The man turned and looked at Ethan. His expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. A quick inventory. A conclusion made faster than it should have been. Ethan recognized the look. He'd spent enough time in enough rooms to know when someone was reading him as a problem. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we sort this out." "I have an invitation," Ethan said. "I understand. If you'll just step over here." "We're not stepping anywhere," Ethan said, and he was careful. He was very careful to keep his voice measured. "My name is Ethan Carter. I received this invitation through the foundation, and my wife was Corporal Claire Carter, 3rd Infantry Division, who is memorialized at this event. I'm here with my daughter to attend this gala. That's it." The security man studied him. The name in the system shows a discrepancy. Then fix the discrepancy. It had gotten louder around them, or maybe the surrounding noise had just gotten quieter. Either way, Ethan was aware that they were drawing attention. Guests nearby had slowed their conversations. A couple standing 6 feet away had turned, not fully, but enough. 2 women in gowns near the bar had stopped talking and were watching with the particular alertness of people who expect something uncomfortable to happen and want to see it. Sophie's hand tightened in his. He looked down at her. She was watching the security man with wide, careful eyes. Not crying, not scared exactly. Just watching. The way children watch when they're memorizing something they don't fully understand yet. "Daddy?" she said quietly. "It's fine," he told her. The security man said, "Sir, until we can verify..." "Verify what?" Ethan said. "Verify what? Exactly. I have a printed invitation with my name on it. The guest list is our system of record. Your system is wrong." A second security guard had materialized at the edge of Ethan's peripheral vision, and he was aware that the room had shifted around him. More faces turned now, more conversations stalled. He could see a cluster of men in decorated military dress about 20 feet away, all of them watching. The check-in woman was on the phone, speaking in a low, urgent murmur. A man in a suit near the center of the room had taken his phone out and Ethan was almost certain, filming. He thought about Claire, about the conversation in the hospital, about the promise. He stayed where he was. The security man lowered his voice. "Sir, I understand this is frustrating, but I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside while we sort this out. You can bring your daughter. She's not going outside. We just got here." "Sir, we're not leaving." Ethan held his voice flat and level. "We are not leaving this lobby. Find your coordinator, fix your system, and let us through." The security man looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's arm. Not a grip, not yet, but the beginning of one. And that was when Sophie said, loudly, clearly, in a voice that cut across the nearby conversations like something cold dropped into warm water, "Why are you grabbing my daddy?" The whole nearby area went quiet. The security man pulled his hand back. He hadn't expected that. Nobody ever factored in the 7-year-old. Sophie was looking up at him with complete, uncomplicated directness. "He didn't do anything," she said. "We came here for my mom." The silence around them stretched. Ethan looked at his daughter and felt something crack open in his chest. Not grief. Not exactly, though grief was part of it. Something older and more complicated. He crouched down to Sophie's level. "Hey," he said. "Hey, look at me." She looked at him. "You're doing great," he told her. "We're going to sort this out, okay?" "Okay," she said. He stood back up, and when he looked at the security man, his expression had changed. Not angry, not broken, just very, very clear. "Get me your coordinator," he said. "Right now, please." It was the man in the center of the room who moved first. Not the coordinator, not another security guard. A guest. An older man, 70s, barrel-chested, wearing a dress uniform so decorated it almost looked like a costume. He'd been part of the military cluster that had been watching from across the room, and now he stepped forward with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had never once had to push through a crowd. They just moved. "What's happening here?" He addressed the security man directly, and there was a quality to his voice that said he was not asking. The security man straightened involuntarily. "Sir, this is a registration issue. Is this man a guest?" "We're working to verify, does he have an invitation?" "Sir, does he have an invitation?" the man repeated. Not louder, but with the kind of stillness that made loud unnecessary. A pause. "Yes, sir. There's a discrepancy in the system. Then someone made an error in the system," the older man said, as if that were the simplest fact in the world. He turned and looked at Ethan for the first time. His eyes were direct, slightly pale with age, and they moved over Ethan with the practiced economy of someone who had spent decades reading people quickly. Then they moved to Sophie. Something changed in his face when he looked at Sophie. "What's your name?" he asked her. Sophie looked at her father. Ethan gave a small nod. "Sophie," she said. "Sophie Carter." The older man was quiet for a moment. "Carter," he repeated. "My mom was Claire Carter," Sophie said. "She's on the wall." The man's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan. "Ethan Carter." It wasn't a question anymore. "Yes," Ethan said. And something moved across the old man's face that Ethan couldn't fully read. Recognition, and beneath it something raw, something he clearly wasn't accustomed to showing in public. "Richard Hale," the man said. "I served with your wife, and I know your name, son." He turned and spoke directly to the security guard. "These people are my guests for the remainder of this evening. We're done here." The security man nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard Hale looked at Ethan once more, a longer look this time, like he was confirming something he wasn't sure he'd believed. Then he said, "Come on, let me find you both somewhere to sit." "What?" But by then, the room had already seen everything. The people who'd been watching, and by now that was most of the nearby ballroom floor, had caught the sequence, the invitation, the security guard, the child's voice, the decorated veteran stepping in. The narrative had assembled itself in real time in the minds of 100 people who hadn't known what they were looking at 5 minutes ago. Ethan could feel the shift. The stares that had been coolly appraising were now something else, some of them guilty, some of them curious, a handful openly sympathetic. A woman nearby pressed her lips together and looked down at her drink. One of the men who'd been in the military cluster said something quiet to the man beside him, and neither of them looked comfortable. Ethan noticed all of it and tried to look like he hadn't. He kept Sophie's hand in his and followed Richard Hale through the room. Sophie, for her part, was looking around at everything. The chandeliers, the flowers on the tables, the quartet that had started up again somewhere near the far wall. She seemed less shaken by what had happened than Ethan was. That was children for you. They moved through things faster, maybe because they didn't yet have the full context for how bad something could have been. "It's nice in here," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "That man is very decorated," she observed, looking at the back of Richard Hale's uniform. "He is." "More than Mommy?" Ethan thought about it. "Different. Your mom had different service." Sophie processed this for a moment. "She was still brave, though." "She was the bravest person I ever knew," Ethan said, and he meant it the same way he'd meant it the first time he said it to Sophie when she was 4 and barely old enough to hold the words, completely, without performance, because it happened to be the truest thing he knew. Sophie squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. Richard Hale led them to a table near the edge of the main room, set slightly apart from the larger clusters of guests. He pulled out a chair for Sophie with an old-world formality that made her look briefly surprised and then pleased. A waiter appeared almost immediately with water, and Sophie received a small glass of something fizzy with a slice of lemon that she studied as if it were a minor scientific event. "Sparkling water," Ethan told her. She sipped it experimentally, made a face, sipped it again. Richard Hale sat across from them, his hands flat on the table, looking at Ethan in that steady, careful way. Up close, he was older than he'd seemed from across the room. The kind of old that comes from hard living, rather than just years. The skin around his eyes mapped with the kind of lines that meant he'd squinted into a lot of difficult light in his life. "I've been hoping to cross paths with you for a long time," he said. Ethan didn't know what to do with that. "Is that right?" "Your name came up. When we were putting together the memorial program." He paused. "There was some confusion, administrative, about your status. Nobody seemed to have a current contact for you." "I moved," Ethan said simply. "I gathered." Hale looked at his hands briefly. "I didn't know about your wife until recently. I'm sorry." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." "She was a good soldier. I only served alongside her briefly. Different units, same theater, but the reports I heard were she was someone you wanted on your side." "Yeah," Ethan said. "She was." Sophie was now rotating her lemon slice with one finger, seemingly absorbed in the physics of it. But Ethan knew she was listening. Sophie was always listening, even when she appeared to be doing something else entirely. Claire had been the same way. "Can I ask you something?" Richard Hale said. "Go ahead." "You're not still in?" "No." "How long since you separated?" 4 years. Hale nodded slowly. "And they couldn't find you for 4 years?" "I wasn't hiding," Ethan said. I didn't stay connected. I needed to be somewhere else for a while." It wasn't the whole answer, but it was the one he was prepared to give. What the whole answer looked like. The way he'd come home to find Claire already 6 months into the illness that nobody had named yet. The way the next 2 years had collapsed into a series of hospitals and treatments and parking lots and waiting rooms. The way he'd learned to hold everything very still because movement felt like it might make things break faster. That wasn't a story for this table. Not tonight. Hale seemed to understand that there was more than what was being said, and he didn't push. He was from a generation that understood which silences to leave alone. "Well," he said, "I'm glad you came." "I made a promise," Ethan said. Hale looked at Sophie, then back at Ethan. Something in his expression shifted, a softening that didn't quite match his general demeanor, like finding an unlocked door in a building you expected to be sealed. "She looks like her," he said quietly. "The photograph in the program. She looks like Claire." Ethan looked at Sophie, really looked at her, the way you sometimes needed to do from the outside, as if you were a stranger. The dark eyes, the particular shape of her mouth when she was focused on something. The way her head tilted slightly when she was thinking. Yeah, he said. She does. Sophie looked up at that exact moment. Are you talking about me? We were saying you look like your mom, Ethan told her. Sophie considered this. I know, she said, with the simple confidence of someone who had been told this all her life and had long since made peace with it. Then she went back to her lemon slice. The room had begun to settle into its formal program, and Ethan was grateful for the reduced attention. Over the next hour, he sat with Sophie at the table while the evening's official sequence unfolded. Introductions from the foundation chair, a formal welcome from a general whose name he didn't catch, the first of what would be several remembrance segments honoring soldiers whose names were on the memorial wall. When Claire's name was read, Sophie sat up very straight. It was part of a longer list, maybe 40 names, and her name fell in the second half, read by a woman at the podium in a clear, practiced voice. Corporal Claire Ann Carter, 3rd Infantry Division, brief service record, brief citation. That was it. 20 seconds, maybe. And then the next name. But Sophie was still sitting straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the podium. Ethan watched her. That was her, Sophie said softly. That was her, he agreed. Sophie nodded once, slowly, not crying, just receiving it, the weight of hearing her mother's name said out loud in a room full of people who were actually listening, as if it made something real that Sophie had been holding in the abstract. Then she reached over without looking and put her hand on Ethan's forearm and left it there. He put his hand over hers. They stayed like that until the list was finished. There were several tables between theirs and the main bar, and throughout the evening, Ethan became aware that they were still being watched. More discreetly now, but watched. The couple who'd stared at him during the security incident had repositioned themselves somewhere they could see him without obviously looking. A few people had approached Richard Hale during the reception portion and been gestured briefly toward Ethan's table, though Hale had sent them away. Something about that protective instinct surprised Ethan, though he was grateful for it. What he hadn't expected was how much being in the room would hit him. He'd prepared himself for Sophie's response. He'd thought through the practical things, the memorial wall, the program, Claire's name. He'd thought through the logistics of it all. He hadn't thought through what it would feel like to be in a room full of people who had served, who had lost people, who carried the specific weight that Ethan had been carrying alone for 4 years. Not conspicuously, not loudly, but the recognition was there. In the way a vet across the room caught his eye for a fraction longer than strangers usually do. In the way an older woman at the next table, decorated with her own medals, glanced at Sophie and then at Ethan and gave him a look that contained more understanding than a full conversation could have managed. He hadn't realized, until he was sitting inside it, how isolated he'd been. 4 years. He told himself he didn't need this, that he had Sophie and his work and his routine, and that was sufficient. He told himself the military world was behind him, that it was associated with too much loss, that building a quiet life was what Claire would have wanted for him. But sitting here in this room with his daughter's hand on his arm, he wasn't sure that was true anymore. Or rather, he wasn't sure it had been true so much as it had been easier. There was a difference. Sophie fell asleep around 9:30, which he hadn't expected, but probably should have. She folded herself sideways in the chair with the absolute unselfconscious bonelessness of a sleeping child, her head tipped against the table, and he draped his jacket over her shoulders and let her stay. Richard Hale came back around 10, accompanied by a younger woman, early 30s, sharp-featured, dark hair pulled back, wearing a dark green dress that looked expensive without trying to look expensive. She moved with the particular kind of confidence that comes from having been the person in the room who mattered for long enough that it had stopped requiring effort. "My daughter," Hale said. "Olivia." She extended her hand. Her grip was direct. "Olivia Bennett. I've been wanting to meet you." "Ethan Carter." He shook her hand. "I've apparently been a difficult person to find." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "So I've heard." She looked at Sophie, asleep in the chair, and her expression shifted. Not sentimental exactly, but something in the vicinity. "She's out. She runs hot when she's excited and then just crashes," Ethan said. "Smart system," Olivia said. She sat in the chair across from him that Richard Hale had occupied earlier. Hale himself settled in beside her, and Ethan noticed the way they positioned themselves near each other. Not the formal adjacency of public figures, but something closer. The comfortable proximity of people who had learned, maybe the hard way, to rely on each other. "My father tells me you knew Claire," Olivia said. "She was my wife." She nodded. "I know. I wanted to say I'm sorry. My father told me about her only recently. He knew her service record before he knew who she was personally." She glanced at her father, then back at Ethan. "He doesn't talk about that period very much, but he talks about her." Ethan wasn't sure what to say to that. "She made an impression," Hale said from beside her. Claire Carter had a way of making an impression. "She did," Ethan agreed. He looked at Sophie, still asleep, and thought about how his wife would have handled this evening. The security situation, the staring guests, all of it. She would not have stayed as quiet as he had. She would have used her voice sooner and sharper, and she would have made the security man feel about 3 inches tall without raising her volume once. And then she would have walked straight to the nearest table, introduced herself to whoever was sitting there, and made sure Sophie had something good to eat. That was the thing about Claire. She didn't navigate rooms. She inhabited them. Ethan had always been better at walls. She would have hated the scene tonight, he said, almost to himself. Then, realizing he'd said it out loud, the thing at the door. "Most people would," Olivia said. "She would have handled it differently than I did." "You handled it fine," Hale said. "I handled it without making it worse," Ethan corrected. "That's not the same thing." Hale looked at him. "Sometimes that's the whole job," he said. At some point in the next hour, without it being a decision he made consciously, Ethan found himself talking. Not about the hard things. Not about the years after Claire died, or the particular loneliness of raising Sophie alone, or the way grief had its own strange grammar that kept shifting just when you thought you understood the pattern. But about Sophie, about some of the stranger and funnier moments of the past 4 years, and about Claire before the illness, the person she'd been when she was fully herself. Olivia listened in a way that felt genuine. She asked occasional questions that landed exactly, not the polite questions people ask to appear interested, but the specific kind that told you the other person was actually tracking what you were saying and finding their own thread in it. He learned things about her in the gaps. She ran a mid-sized tech firm that she'd taken from a failing startup to something considerably larger over the past 5 years. She'd grown up largely around her father's work, the ceremonies, the absences, the complicated emotional logistics of being a military family's child. She had a directness that, Ethan suspected, had cost her something socially at some point, and that she had decided was worth the cost. He wasn't going to pretend he didn't notice her. He noticed her. It had been 4 years since he'd sat across a table from someone and felt the particular, uncomfortable awareness of another person's presence, the self-consciousness of wanting to sound better than you were sure you were coming across, the strange irritation of that wanting. He'd forgotten what it felt like. Or rather, he'd managed to forget, which was a different thing. He filed it away. This was not the night for that. Tonight was for Sophie and for Claire and for the promise he'd finally kept. Around 11, Sophie stirred, opened her eyes, looked around with the specific disorientation of a child waking somewhere unfamiliar, and then located Ethan and settled. "Did I miss stuff?" she asked. "Some," Ethan said. "Did I miss the wall?" "No, we'll go see it before we leave." She pushed herself upright, accepted that with a nod, and then noticed Olivia across the table and regarded her with frank, unfiltered appraisal. "Who are you?" "Sophie," Ethan said. "It's all right," Olivia said. To Sophie, "I'm Olivia. I'm a friend of the man who helped your dad at the door." "The old decorated man?" "That's my father, yes." Sophie considered this. "He was nice," she said finally, "even though he looked scary." Olivia's expression did something unexpected. It softened, and then, briefly, she laughed. Not politely, but genuinely, the kind that comes out whether you mean it to or not. "He does look scary," she agreed. "He's aware." Sophie seemed satisfied with this. She picked up her sparkling water from where it had been sitting and finished the remaining inch of it with the solemnity of someone completing a task left half done. Ethan looked at the two of them, his daughter, awake and alert despite everything, and this woman he'd met an hour ago who was leaning slightly forward with her elbows on the table and her chin on her hands, watching Sophie with an expression he couldn't categorize. And he thought, this is a strange night. It was. It had been strange from the beginning. The humiliation at the door, and then Richard Hale, and now this. But underneath the strangeness was something he hadn't expected to feel here. He felt, somehow, less alone than he'd felt in years. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure it was safe to do anything with it tonight. But he recognized it. That was enough for now. Sophie set down her empty glass and looked at Ethan with the particular clarity of a child who knows exactly what she wants and has run out of patience. "Can we go see the wall?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. He pushed back his chair. "Yeah, let's go see the wall." The memorial wall was at the far end of the Alderman Grand's east corridor, past the main ballroom, and through a set of tall wooden doors that opened into a quieter, lower-lit space, a long gallery that had been converted for the foundation's use. The walls on both sides were covered in dark panels, and on those panels, row by row in small engraved letters, were names, hundreds of them. Sophie stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the length of it. "It goes all the way down," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. There were a few other guests in the gallery, an older couple standing near the middle section, a younger man in uniform who stood alone near the far end with his cap in his hands. Nobody spoke loudly in here. It was the kind of room that asked for quiet without having to say so. Olivia had followed them from the table, staying a step or two back, and Ethan was aware of her presence the way you're aware of someone being careful. The particular consideration of a person who understands they're on the edge of something that doesn't belong to them. He appreciated it. He didn't say so. Sophie walked forward slowly, her eyes moving across the panels on her left side, reading names with the focused, slightly halting pace of a second grader encountering unfamiliar words. She didn't ask for help. She was looking for one specific word, and she was going to find it herself. Ethan let her look. He already knew where Claire's name was. He'd looked it up on the Foundation's website 3 weeks ago, middle panel, second row from the top, left section. But he didn't guide Sophie there. This was something she needed to do at her own speed. It took her maybe 4 minutes. Then she stopped. Put one finger against the wall, just below a line of names. Moved her finger along the row carefully, letter by letter. "Carter," she said. Then reading the full line, "Claire Ann Carter." "That's her," Ethan said. Sophie stood in front of the panel with her finger still touching the engraved letters, not pressing hard, just making contact, the way you touch something to confirm it's real. "It's cold," she said. "The panel." "Yeah." "Her name's here forever?" "Forever." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a smaller voice than she'd used all evening, "Does she know we came?" Ethan wasn't equipped to answer that question the way he probably should have been. He'd never been particularly good at the soft answers, at the comfortable reassurances that parents reach for in these moments, because the honest answer is too large and shapeless to hand to a child. He crouched down beside her so they were at the same level, both of them looking at Claire's name. "I think," he said carefully, "that we came for us. So we'd know. So you'd know. And I think that matters, whether she can feel it or not." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that counted. Then she nodded once. "Okay," she said, and she pressed her palm flat against the panel over Claire's name and kept it there for a long moment. Ethan's chest hurt. He didn't try to manage it. He just let it. Behind them, neither of them heard Olivia make a sound. But when Ethan stood and turned, he saw that she was standing near the doorway with her arms crossed loosely and her eyes very still, and that she was looking at Sophie with an expression she wasn't entirely in control of. She caught Ethan looking and straightened slightly. "Sorry," she said quietly, as if apologizing for her own face. "Don't be," he said. Guess they found Richard Hale waiting for them back at the table when they returned, accompanied now by a woman in her 60s whom he introduced as his assistant, Marion, and a younger man in dress uniform whose name Ethan caught as Lieutenant Colonel Graves. Both of them looked at Ethan with the careful, slightly complicated expression he'd been receiving all evening. The expression of people who knew something about him that he hadn't told them himself and weren't quite sure how to hold it. Graves put out his hand. "Sir, it's an honor." Ethan shook it. "You don't have to call me that." "I know," Graves said, with a tone that suggested he would, anyway. Hale was watching him again, that steady, measuring look. Ethan had spent enough time around senior officers to know the difference between scrutiny and appraisal, and this was the latter. Hale was putting things together, working through something. "There's something I'd like to say to you," Hale said. "Tonight, if you're willing. Not here at the table. There's a side room the Foundation is using, quieter. I want to talk to you properly." Ethan looked at Sophie, who had climbed back into her chair and was working on the remains of a bread roll that had appeared from somewhere. "She can come," Hale said. "Marion can sit with her if she'd prefer." Sophie, without looking up, "I'll come." Ethan looked at her. "You sure? You could stay here with—" "I'll come," Sophie repeated in the tone that meant the discussion was over. Ethan looked at Hale. "She'll come." The side room was smaller than the gallery, a private event room with a round table and chairs, used now as a green room for the evening's organizers. There were water bottles and a half-empty coffee thermos on the sideboard. The noise of the main event was reduced to a muffled, distant version of itself. Hale closed the door. He remained standing. Ethan sat across the table from him, and Sophie settled in the chair beside Ethan, and Olivia took a seat slightly apart, near the sideboard, in the way she'd been doing all evening, present but giving space. Hale pulled out the chair across from Ethan, but didn't sit in it, just rested both hands on the back of it. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it in person because I've been carrying it for a long time, and I think you deserve to hear it face to face." He paused, the brief, deliberate pause of a man who doesn't waste words. "In 2017, there was an extraction mission, classified, Eastern Sector. Your unit was secondary support." He looked at Ethan. "You know what I'm referring to." Ethan said nothing. "I was the ranking officer on a vehicle that took a hit during the withdrawal," Hale continued. "We had wounded, multiple. The forward route was closed. We were pinned." He stopped, looked down at his hands on the chair back, then back at Ethan. "Someone from the secondary unit came through, on foot, in contested territory, pulled 2 men out of that vehicle, went back in a second time." He stopped again. "Then came back a third time for the third man, under fire. The whole time." The room was quiet. Sophie was watching Hale. She had the bread roll in both hands, but she'd stopped eating it. "That man," Hale said, "refused evacuation for himself, refused commendation, refused the full debrief because his wife was stateside and she'd just been diagnosed with something serious, and he had compassionate leave approved and he was getting on a plane." He looked directly at Ethan. "That was you." Ethan said nothing for a moment, then, "The commendation wasn't appropriate. I did what was in front of me." "You carried a 200-pound man through 100 meters of unsecured terrain," Hale said flatly. "Twice. The third was his own legs. You guided him. He was capable of walking. He needed someone to pull him upright." "Ethan." Hale said his name like a full stop. "I was one of the men in that vehicle." The room shifted. Ethan looked at him. Something landed in his chest. Not surprise exactly, because he'd started to suspect as much the moment Hale mentioned the vehicle, but the full weight of it settling. He looked at the older man across the table, the age-mapped face, the pale eyes, the particular stillness of someone who had been living with gratitude for years and not known where to put it. "I didn't know your name," Ethan said. It came out slightly rough. "The roster. I never had names." "I know," Hale said. "I found yours through the Foundation. It took years. I want you to understand something." He pulled the chair out and finally sat, heavily, like the standing had cost him more than he let on. "I have 3 grandchildren. I have a daughter." He glanced briefly at Olivia. "I have a life I would not have had. And for a very long time, I did not know who to thank for it." Silence. Olivia was watching her father in a way that Ethan recognized as complicated. Love and old pain and something that might have been relief, all moving across her face in the careful, controlled way of someone who'd learned early to manage her expressions. Sophie said quietly, "You were in the car that my daddy helped?" Everyone looked at her. Hale turned to her. His expression, which had been tightly controlled through all of that, softened in a way that changed his whole face. "Yes," he said, "I was." Sophie looked at her father, then back at Hale. She thought about it with that deliberate 7-year-old seriousness. Then she said, "So your grandkids wouldn't be here if my daddy didn't help?" Hale's jaw shifted. "That's right." Sophie absorbed this. "That's a lot of people," she said. Hale looked at her for a long moment. "It is," he said. "That's exactly right. That's a lot of people." Sophie looked at Ethan again, and Ethan recognized the look. It was the same look she gave him sometimes at home when she'd figured something out about him, something she hadn't known before, something that went into the file she was quietly building about who her father was. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with those dark eyes that were Claire's eyes. And then she went back to the bread roll. It was Olivia who broke the silence. "There's something else," she said. She was looking at her father, and something in her tone had changed. It was steadier now, more deliberate, with the quality of someone who has decided to say a thing before they've fully figured out how to say it. "Dad, do you want to—" "Let me," Hale said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded envelope. It was worn at the corners, like it had been handled more than once, taken out and put back maybe over a period of time. He set it on the table and slid it toward Ethan. Ethan looked at it. His name was on the front, handwritten. He recognized the handwriting immediately and completely, the way you recognize something your body knew before your brain caught up. He didn't pick it up. "Where did you get this?" he said. It came out flat, which he hadn't intended. "Claire sent it to the foundation," Hale said quietly, "before she died. She sent several things for the memorial program, personal records, a letter to be included with her service citation, and this, with a note that it was to be delivered to you in person at a foundation event, not by mail." He paused. "The administrative failures that lost your contact information, they also delayed this. I'm sorry it took so long." Ethan was still looking at the envelope. Sophie had gone very still. He picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, though he wasn't sure why he'd expected weight. He turned it over. The seal on the back was intact. No one had opened it. He put it in his jacket pocket. "I'll read it later," he said. Hale nodded. "Of course." There was a beat of something that wasn't quite awkward and wasn't quite comfortable. The particular suspended quality of a moment that has delivered something significant and isn't sure what comes next. Sophie said, "Is it from Mommy?" Ethan looked at her. "Yeah." She looked at his jacket pocket and then back at his face, and he watched her process it. The fact of it, a letter from her mother, existing in the world, waiting inside cloth and paper a foot from her hand. Her expression didn't collapse, but it came close. Her mouth pressed together for a moment. "Can I see it too?" she asked. "Later?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Later. We'll read it together." She nodded, pressed her lips together again, looked down at the table. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. They came back out into the main ballroom a short time later, and the evening had moved into its later phase. The formal program long over, the room looser now, more wine and more glasses, smaller groups forming and breaking apart. The quartet had switched to something easier, the kind of music that stays in the background without trying. But the room's relationship to Ethan had changed. It had changed while they were in the side room, and he understood that this was because Richard Hale's story had not stayed in that room. The older man had mentioned, before they returned to the main floor, that he intended to say something brief from the podium. Not about Ethan specifically, not publicly, but that people had been asking about him all evening, and he wanted the room to understand who they'd been looking at. Ethan had said, "You don't have to do that." Hale had looked at him. "I know," he said in the same tone his daughter had used earlier, meaning he was going to anyway. And so, sometime while Ethan and Sophie had been finding their seats again, Richard Hale had stood at the microphone, briefly, without ceremony, and said something to the room that Ethan had not heard directly, but that had clearly landed, because when he looked up, he found that the people nearest to them were sitting differently. The military men from the cluster near the bar had come closer. Veterans he didn't recognize were nodding at him with a specific kind of nod, the one that carries weight because the person giving it knows exactly what they're acknowledging. The couple who had stared during the security incident were nowhere near his line of sight, which was a kindness of spatial luck. A man he didn't know came over and shook his hand and said simply, "Thank you for your service, brother," and moved on. Another stopped and said something to Sophie about her mother that made Sophie straighten up again with that particular pride she wore when someone acknowledged Claire. A woman in a navy dress uniform put her hand briefly on Ethan's arm and said, "We didn't know." And Ethan said, "It's fine." Though what he meant was, "It's all right, not fine, but all right." None of it was easy. He didn't love being seen this way, being assembled into a story in other people's minds. It felt slightly out of his control, which he disliked, and slightly false, because the story people were constructing was cleaner than the actual thing, which was messier and sadder and had cost more than could fit into a ballroom moment. But it was also, and he admitted this to himself, sitting in that noise with his daughter beside him, something he hadn't known he needed. He hadn't known he'd needed to be in a room where people knew, not the full truth of it, not the texture and the cost and the years of silence, but the basic fact that he had served, that he had lost, that he was still here doing the hard, slow work of putting a life back together. He hadn't known it would matter to him to be known, even a little, even approximately. He had spent so long being invisible, by choice, mostly, that he had started to mistake the invisibility for self-sufficiency. Yes, Olivia had stayed beside him through most of it, which he noticed without remarking on. She navigated the attention with him in a way that was genuinely useful. She redirected conversations that were getting too long. She stepped slightly in front of Sophie when someone was leaning in with too much eagerness. She answered questions that were being asked at Ethan without actually consulting him about whether he wanted to answer them. She did it without making it obvious, which was a skill, and she did it without asking if he wanted the help, which was either arrogant or perceptive, and he was leaning toward the latter. At some point, when there was a lull and they were standing near the edge of the room with Sophie sitting on a nearby chair and working on something she'd obtained from the dessert table, Ethan turned to Olivia and said, "You didn't have to do all this." "Do what?" she said. "Tonight. Any of it. You could have let your father handle it." She considered that. "Could I?" "You could have. You chose not to." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the room. "My father's been wanting to find you for years," she said. "He told me about the extraction when I was 19. He'd been looking for the name and the face to match the story for a long time." She paused. "I don't know. When I saw you at the door with Sophie and understood who you were, I wasn't going to stand there." "Most people would have," Ethan said. "Not bitterly, just factually." "I know," she said. "That's not a reason." He looked at her sideways. She was looking straight ahead at the room, her arms crossed, and she had the particular quality of someone who has said more than they planned to and is now recalibrating. "How long have you known about your father's story?" Ethan asked. 19 years. He told me when I was going off to college. He said he wanted me to understand before I left home that there were people in the world who did extraordinary things for no recognition and went back to their lives like it never happened. He said it was the most important thing he knew about the world. She glanced at him briefly. He talked about this unnamed soldier for years, and then I go to a gala and the soldier walks in with a 7-year-old in braids. Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. "The braids aren't my best work." "They looked fine," Olivia said. "The left one's lower." "She seems unbothered." "She was very gracious about it." Olivia made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then they were quiet for a moment, and the quiet was easy. Easy in the way that quiet is only easy with people you haven't manufactured comfort with, where it just exists without needing to be filled. Sophie appeared at Ethan's elbow with chocolate on her lower lip and one hand extended, holding a small square of something. "I got you one too," she said. Ethan looked at it. "What is it?" "Fancy chocolate," Sophie said. He took it. "Thank you." She produced a second square and held it out to Olivia, who accepted it with a seriousness that matched the gift. "Thank you, Sophie," Olivia said. "You're welcome," Sophie said. She disappeared back toward the dessert table. Ethan looked at the chocolate square in his hand and thought about Claire, who had always said he didn't accept small kindnesses gracefully, that he'd stand there with them in his hand like he didn't know what to do next. She hadn't been wrong. He ate the chocolate. The evening wound down the way long evenings do, not abruptly, but in increments. The crowd thinning in stages, the music dropping to something slower, the lighting adjusting almost imperceptibly toward the warmer end. By 11:30, Sophie was fighting sleep again in a different chair, her determination to stay awake more admirable than practical. Richard Hale came to say goodnight around midnight. He shook Ethan's hand, a long, firm, two-handed grip, the kind that carries what words haven't covered, and said nothing for a moment, which was more than enough. Then he looked at Sophie, who had propped herself awake on one elbow and was watching him with heavy-lidded eyes. "You look like your mother," Hale told her. "I know," Sophie said, for what was at least the third time that evening. But this time she was smiling when she said it. Hale nodded once. He walked away without looking back, the way men of his particular temperament tend to, like they trust the goodbye to hold without confirmation. Ethan watched him go. The envelope in his jacket pocket felt like it had weight now that it hadn't when he first put it there. He reached up once and touched it, just briefly, through the fabric. Not yet, but soon. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. "Can we go?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "We're going." He helped her up, and she immediately leaned against his side with the full boneless surrender of a child who has burned through every reserve she had and is now running on fumes and stubbornness. He got an arm around her, and she tucked in close, and they started toward the exit. Olivia fell into step beside them, which he had half expected and half not. "I'll walk you out," she said. He didn't argue. They walked through the thinning room together, the three of them, past the tables and the scattered remaining guests and the waitstaff beginning their quiet work of resetting, out through the lobby with its marble floor and its diminished grandeur, and through the front doors into the night air outside. It was cool. Not cold, but the kind of cool that registers after hours in a heated room, sharp at the edges, clean, the city's particular nighttime smell of asphalt and something distant and faintly green. Sophie made a small sound against his side. He looked down and she was asleep. Genuinely, completely asleep, walking, or being carried, technically, since her feet were barely moving. He shifted his grip and got both arms under her, and she settled without waking. He stood on the front steps of the Alderman Grand with his sleeping daughter in his arms and felt the cold air on his face. Olivia stood beside him, not talking, just being there. After a moment, "She's out?" she said. She held on longer than I expected. "She's tough." "She's Claire's daughter," Ethan said. Then, because it came up naturally, "She's mine too, but she got the toughness from Claire." Olivia looked at him. In the cooler light outside, away from the warm glow of the ballroom, she looked slightly different, less guarded maybe, or just tired in the way everyone eventually gets when a long evening uncoils. There was a small crease along her left cheek from where she'd rested her head on her hand at the table earlier, and she hadn't noticed it, and Ethan did not point it out. "Will you come to more foundation events?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I don't know, maybe. My father would like that." "I know." She was quiet a moment. Then, "What about other things? Do you stay connected to anyone from your service?" "Not really." "Is that by choice?" "Was," he said. "For a while. Then it just became the way things were." She nodded, seemed to accept that without pushing, which he appreciated. The valet had brought the truck around. It sat at the bottom of the steps, slightly incongruous among the last few remaining town cars, and Ethan felt a brief, irrational affection for it. Its ordinariness, its scratched tailgate, the booster seat visible through the back window. He started down the steps. "Ethan," Olivia said. He turned. She was standing at the top of the steps, arms crossed against the cool, and she looked at him in a way that was direct and slightly careful at the same time, like she was measuring the distance between what she wanted to say and what was actually appropriate. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said. "Both of you." He held her gaze for a moment. Sophie shifted slightly in his arms. "Yeah," he said. Me too. He carried his daughter down to the truck. He didn't open the letter that night. He got Sophie home, got her out of her dress and into pajamas without fully waking her, got her into bed with the specific efficiency of a parent who had performed this exact sequence hundreds of times in the dark. He tucked the blanket around her shoulders and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe, the way he still did sometimes. And then he went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with a glass of water and the envelope in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Claire's handwriting on the front, his name, in the slightly forward-leaning script she'd always had, the letters pressed firmly into the paper like she meant every one of them. She'd always written like that, with intention, like even a grocery list deserved to be taken seriously. He picked it up once, set it back down. The problem wasn't that he didn't want to read it. The problem was that reading it would make something final that he'd been keeping slightly unfinished for 4 years. As long as the letter existed somewhere in the world unopened, there was still a version of Claire that had something left to say to him. Once he read it, that was over. Whatever she'd written would be what it was, and he'd have to carry it, and there was no going back to the version where he didn't know. He wasn't ready tonight. He'd had enough tonight. His chest was already full. He put the envelope on the kitchen shelf above the toaster, wedged between a cookbook he never used and a small framed photo of Sophie at age 4. Then he went to bed and lay there for a long time in the dark, and eventually, somewhere around 2 a.m, he slept. The days that followed the gala were strange in a way he hadn't anticipated. The world hadn't changed. He still drove to work, still ran maintenance calls, still made Sophie's lunches the night before, and argued with her every morning about whether chocolate cereal constituted a breakfast food. The warehouse was the same. The truck made the same noise at cold starts. Nothing was different, except that the envelope was on the shelf, and he knew it was there every time he walked past it. And he hadn't told Sophie yet that he hadn't read it, because he'd said they'd read it together, and now every day that passed without reading, it was another day he was falling short of that. Sophie hadn't pushed. He'd expected her to. She was 7, and she'd been told there was a letter from her mother, and she was not, in general, a patient person. But she hadn't brought it up. She'd look at the shelf sometimes, briefly, in the same way Ethan did, and then look away. They were both circling it in their own private ways, and neither of them was saying so. On the 4th day after the gala, he came home from work to find Sophie sitting at the kitchen table with her homework in front of her and her pencil not moving, just sitting there staring at the middle distance. "Hey," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "How was school?" "Fine," she said, which meant something had happened, but she wasn't ready to talk about it yet. He washed his hands, started pulling things out for dinner, let the silence breathe for a few minutes, because that was how Sophie worked. She needed space to get from not talking to talking, and if you pushed, you'd lose her for the evening. After about 5 minutes, she said, without preamble, "Emma at school said her mom volunteers at the school book fair." "Yeah?" "She said her mom comes every year. She said she helps set up all the books, and Emma gets to come early before the other kids." "That sounds nice," Ethan said carefully. "I'm going to the book fair next week." "I know, I signed the permission slip. Who's going to be there with me?" He turned around from the counter. Sophie was looking at him steadily. No performance in it, just asking. The question wasn't about the book fair. He knew that, and she knew that he knew that. "I'll try to get the shift covered," he said. "You said that for the Halloween parade." "I know." "And the fall festival." "I know, Sophie." She looked at him for a moment and then back at her homework. She picked up her pencil, turned it in her fingers, set it down again. "I'm not mad," she said. "You can be mad." "I'm not," she said. She stopped. "Forget it." "Hey." He came and sat across from her at the table. "Say it." She pressed her lips together. The same gesture Claire used to make when she was deciding whether to say the actual thing or a safer version of it. "I just want you to be there sometimes," Sophie said. "Like a regular dad." The words sat between them, plain and without cruelty. She hadn't said it to wound him. He could see that. She'd said it because it was true, and because she was 7, and the distance between what she felt and what she said was not yet as managed as it would become. "I know," he said. "You work a lot." "I do." "Mom used to say you work to take care of us. I know that." "She said that?" Sophie nodded. "She said you always showed up where it counted. Those words." She looked at him. I'm just not sure all the places count the same. He sat with that. He didn't argue with it, because he couldn't. She was right in the way children are right sometimes. Without context, without qualifications, in the direct and slightly brutal way of someone who only has access to what they can see and is reporting faithfully on what's there. I'll be at the book fair, he said. You don't have to promise. I will be there, he said. I'll figure it out. I'll be there. She looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Then she nodded and picked up her pencil. Okay, she said, and went back to her homework. He sat there a minute more, looking at his daughter, and then he got up and went to the shelf above the toaster and picked up the envelope. Sophie, he said. She looked up. He held up the letter. Her pencil went still. You want to do this now? He asked. She looked at it, and he could see her working through the same thing he'd been working through all week. The weight of it, the finality. Then she put down her pencil and pushed the homework aside. Yeah, she said. I want to do it now, Saskasi. He sat beside her at the kitchen table. He turned the envelope over and broke the seal. It gave cleanly, like she'd sealed it expecting it to be opened, and pulled out 2 sheets of paper folded together. The top sheet was a letter. The second, he saw immediately, had Sophie's name written on the outside of a smaller folded page inside it, in the same firm, intentional handwriting. There's one for each of us, he said. Sophie's eyes went wide and then steady again. Read yours first, she said. So I know it's okay. He looked at her. Why would it not be okay? I don't know, she said. Just read yours first. He unfolded his letter. He read it. It took him a while, not because it was long, but because he had to stop twice and look at the ceiling and breathe before he could keep going. Sophie sat beside him without moving, without asking, just waiting. When he finished, he set it face down on the table. Okay, Sophie said. He nodded. Is it bad? No, he said. His voice was rougher than he'd meant. It's not bad. He cleared his throat. She says she's sorry she never told me some things. She says I need to stop carrying things alone. She says... He stopped. She says she wants me to let people in, that it's not a betrayal of her, that it's what she wants for me. Sophie absorbed this. She told you to move on? She told me to live, Ethan said. That's different. Sophie thought about that. Then, can I read mine? He handed her the folded page with her name on it. She took it carefully in both hands, like it was something fragile, and unfolded it slowly. He didn't read over her shoulder. He looked at the table and let her have it. He heard her breathing change, heard the slight, shallow catch that meant she was trying not to cry and doing an imperfect job of it. He reached out and put his hand over hers, on the table, not on the letter, just his hand over her free hand, and she pressed back against it without looking up. She read it twice. He knew because he heard the silence reset and then go quiet again. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but her face was set. That particular Sophie expression of grief being held upright by sheer determination. She made me something, Sophie said. What? Sophie held up the letter. Inside the fold, there was a small object that had been tucked into the crease, a delicate chain with a small pendant on it. Not a necklace exactly, more of a keepsake. The pendant was simple, a flat, oval piece of silver, no larger than a thumbnail, with an engraved initial on one side. See. She says it's hers, Sophie said. She says she wore it when she was scared. She said it helped her feel brave. She looked at it in her palm. She says when I'm scared I can hold it. Ethan looked at it. He recognized it. It had been Claire's, a piece she'd worn on a thin chain under her uniform. He'd thought it was lost. He'd looked for it in the weeks after she died and never found it, assumed it had been with her, or lost in the confusion of the hospital and then the arrangements and then the long blur of the months that followed. She had planned. She had been in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to either of them, and she had planned. She had saved the pendant and written the letters and sent them through the foundation and trusted that the system would eventually find a way to get them where they were supposed to go. That was Claire. That was entirely Claire. She did not leave things unfinished, even things that were terrible and unfair, even at the end when she must have been exhausted down to the bone. She also says, Sophie continued, reading again, that Daddy is brave even when he doesn't know it. She says he was the bravest thing in her life. She looked at him. That's what she wrote. Those exact words. Ethan said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. Sophie watched him for a moment. Then she got up from her chair and came around the table and put her arms around him from the side. Her small arms around his ribs, her face against his shoulder, and held on. He put his arm around her and held her back. They stayed that way for a long time in the kitchen, with the dinner half assembled on the counter and the homework on the table and the letters between them, and outside the window the city was doing whatever the city did in the early evening, indifferent and unhurried. He pressed his face against the top of her head. Sophie smelled like school and something slightly chocolate, and she held on tight with her small, fierce arms, and he held back just as tight. The call from Olivia came 8 days after the gala. He almost didn't answer. It was a number he didn't recognize, and he had a policy about unknown numbers that had served him reasonably well, which was that he let them go to voicemail and then listened to the voicemail before deciding. But something made him pick it up on the third ring, some instinct or maybe just bad decision-making, and she said, "It's Olivia Bennett. I got your number from the foundation's coordinator. I hope that's all right." "That's all right," he said. "I wanted to check in," she said. "How's Sophie?" "She's good. She's better than I expected, actually." "And you?" A pause. "Working on it." "That's honest," she said. "You said it directly, so I answered directly." "I appreciate that," she said. "I've spent enough time in rooms where nobody answers things directly." He was outside on the front step of his building, having stepped out to take the call while Sophie did her reading inside. It was cool again, the tail end of autumn pulling the warmth out of the afternoon. He sat on the top step and watched a car go by. "My father would like to see you again," Olivia said. "He's not the type to ask himself, you may have noticed, so I'm asking on his behalf." "I noticed," Ethan said. "He'd like Sophie to meet his grandkids at some point. He thinks it would be good for her. He thinks it would be good for him too, if I'm being honest about what he didn't say." "He has 3, Ethan said, remembering Sophie's observation from the side room. "He does. 2 boys and a girl, 6, 9, and 11. The 9-year-old is—" She paused. "A lot? He's a lot." "Sophie would probably like that," Ethan said. "She's a lot too." "Then they're either going to be best friends or absolute chaos." "Those are usually the same thing with kids." She made the sound that was almost a laugh. Then she said, "And separately, this is me asking, not on my father's behalf, there's a tech summit I'm speaking at next month. Industry event. Low-key by my standards, which means only moderately overwhelming. I'd like it if you came." He hadn't expected that. He took a moment. "Why?" he said. She was quiet for a half-second, like she'd prepared for several responses and was choosing between them. "Honestly? Because I've been thinking about that evening since it ended, and I'd like to see you somewhere that isn't a formal military function." He didn't say anything immediately. "Too direct?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm processing." "That's fair." He looked at the street in front of him, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon facts of the block. A woman walking a large dog, a kid on a bike moving too fast around the corner, a delivery truck idling at the curb. All of it ordinary, all of it continuing regardless. "I have a 7-year-old, he said. "I know. That's a full-time logistical reality. It's not a footnote." "I didn't think it was a footnote," she said. "I asked if you wanted to come to an event. I know what your life is." "You've known me for 1 evening." "I know," she said. "I'm asking for a second one." He rubbed the back of his neck with his free hand. "Give me the details," he said. "I'll see if I can sort the childcare." He could hear that she'd been prepared for him to say no, and that she'd recalibrated. "I'll send them to you," she said. "No pressure." "There's some pressure," he said. "But I'll see." She was quiet for a moment and then said, with something in her voice that might have been warmth or might have been amusement or was possibly both, "You're not easy." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." "That's fine," she said. "I've managed harder." He didn't end up going to the summit. Not because he didn't want to, but because the childcare fell through. His neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, who sometimes watched Sophie on short notice, had a medical appointment that ran long, and he couldn't find a replacement he trusted on that timeline, and he was not going to leave Sophie with someone he didn't trust, regardless of what it cost him. He texted Olivia the afternoon of the event. "Can't make it. Logistics fell through. Sorry." She replied 40 minutes later. Next time. No period, which he found himself analyzing, and then found himself analyzing the fact that he was analyzing it, which was embarrassing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. But there was contact after that. Nothing dramatic, the occasional text, a phone call once every week or so that started at 20 minutes and stretched longer without either of them particularly meaning it to. She called sometimes after what he gathered were long days at the office, and he called sometimes after Sophie was in bed and the apartment was quiet, and he found himself wanting to say something to another adult who would understand it. It was careful. Neither of them was being reckless about it. He was aware of what it was and what it wasn't, and he thought she was too, and the awareness was the thing that kept it from getting out in front of where he was ready to be. But it was something. He didn't push on what, and she didn't either, and that was one of the things he'd started to appreciate about her. She did not push. She was direct, and she was persistent in her own way, but she didn't push. She seemed to understand that some things needed to arrive at their own pace, or they wouldn't hold. It was a Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, when Richard Hale called. Ethan was in the middle of helping Sophie with a subtraction worksheet and had been for 45 minutes longer than the worksheet warranted, because Sophie had decided that the way she'd been taught to do subtraction was wrong and had invented her own method and was now defending it with a persistence that was both exhausting and, he had to admit privately, fairly impressive. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he looked at the screen and saw the name. He'd saved it after the gala. And told Sophie he'd be 1 minute, stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Ethan." The old man's voice was the same in a phone as in person, direct, with a quality that suggested there were no wasted words on the other end. "I'll be brief. There's something I need to tell you, and I'd have preferred to do it in person, but I didn't want to sit on it any longer." Ethan leaned against the hallway wall. "Go ahead." "I spoke to the Foundation's director this week," Hale said, "and to the General Counsel for the 3rd Infantry Memorial Committee. I told them what I told you in that room at the gala, the full story. Your name, the mission, what you did." He paused. "I want you to know that your record is being corrected. The citation that was declined in 2017, the one you walked away from, is being formally reinstated. You'll receive it in the proper way. They'll contact you through official channels, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask for that." "I know. I don't need it." "I know that too," Hale said. "That's actually part of why you're getting it. The men who don't chase these things are usually the ones who've earned them most completely." His voice was level, matter-of-fact, like he was reading from a set of principles he'd carried for decades. "There's also something else. The Foundation wants to offer you a place on their advisory board. Veteran advocacy, specifically around family support. It's not ceremonial. It's actual work. Meetings, decisions, policy input." He stopped. "You'd be good at it, and you'd be honoring what Claire started." "Claire didn't serve long enough for a board position," Ethan said. "No," Hale agreed, "but she served completely, and she raised a daughter alone while doing it, which is the part people don't put on citations." Ethan said nothing. "You don't have to decide tonight," Hale said, "but I wanted you to know it was being offered honestly and not as a formality. I appreciate that. How's Sophie?" The shift in subject was so abrupt it almost caught him off guard. "She's arguing with a math worksheet." A brief sound that was Hale's version of a laugh. "Olivia used to do that. Invent her own arithmetic. Usually turned out she wasn't wrong, just using a different route." "Sophie's not wrong either," Ethan said. "I checked." Silence on the line that was comfortable, the specific quiet of two people who have found, without planning to, that they're at ease with each other. "Bring her by sometime," Hale said. "Not a formal event, just dinner, if you're willing. Marion cooks on Sundays. There's always too much food." Ethan thought about Sophie at that table, the 9-year-old who was apparently a lot, the house full of grandchildren, and the old man with his precise, careful way of saying the things he meant. He thought about what it would mean for Sophie to be in a room full of people who knew who her mother was. "Yeah," he said, "we can do that." "Good." Hale sounded satisfied, not effusive, just satisfied. "Sunday after next, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, Ethan confirmed. He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. Down the hall, he could hear Sophie in the kitchen, apparently having resumed her argument with the worksheet alone, talking herself through her own invented method in a low, confident murmur. He pressed his back against the wall and tipped his head back. He thought about the citation, about the board position, about the Sunday dinner that was somehow already decided, about the envelope he'd read at the kitchen table with his daughter's arms around him. He thought about Claire's words, "Let people in. It's not a betrayal. It's what I want for you." He'd been keeping himself in a small space for a long time. Not hiding. He'd told Richard Hale that, and he'd meant it. But small, tight, managed. The way you live when you're protecting something fragile, when you've decided that the best defense against loss is to offer less surface area. The problem with that was what Sophie had seen before he did, that some places counted more than others. That the math of protection didn't always land where you intended. He was not healed. He was not going to wake up suddenly repaired. That wasn't how any of this worked, and he had enough years on him to know it. But he was, he thought, standing in his hallway listening to his daughter argue with arithmetic in the kitchen, possibly beginning to be ready. Not for everything, not all at once, just for the next thing, whatever that turned out to be. He pushed off the wall and went back to the kitchen. Sophie looked up at him with the expression of someone who had been vindicated by their own persistence. "I figured out the last 3, she said. "Using your method?" "My method is faster," she said. He sat back down across from her. "Show me." She showed him. He checked it. She was right. He looked at his daughter across the table. 7 years old, dark braids, Claire's eyes, a pencil in one hand and the keepsake pendant lying visible at the collar of her shirt where she'd taken to wearing it on a longer chain. Smart and stubborn, and still learning how to carry the things life had put down in front of her. "You know what?" he said. She looked at him. "Your mom would have loved this," he said. "You arguing with the textbook and winning." Sophie considered that for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the polite public smile, but the real one. The one she didn't always hand out. "I know," she said. The Sunday dinner at Richard Hale's house was nothing like Ethan had prepared himself for, which meant it was exactly what he should have expected. He'd pictured something formal, a long table, careful conversation, the particular performance of a man like Hale hosting guests in his home. What he found instead was a house that looked lived in the best possible way, cluttered with the evidence of multiple generations moving through it on a regular basis. Shoes near the front door in 3 different sizes, a half-finished puzzle on a side table, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator that depicted what appeared to be either a dragon or a very ambitious dog. Marion, the woman who cooked on Sundays, was already in motion when they arrived, managing 3 things on the stove simultaneously with the ease of someone who did not consider this remarkable. The 9-year-old, whose name was Jake, took one look at Sophie from across the living room and said, "Do you want to see my thing?" Sophie looked at Ethan for half a second, checking in, then back at Jake. "What thing?" "I built something in the garage. Come on." Sophie looked at Ethan again. "Go ahead," he said. They disappeared into the garage, and he didn't see either of them for 45 minutes. Hale was standing in the doorway to the kitchen with his hands in his pockets when Ethan turned around, watching the whole exchange with an expression that on a different face might have been called delighted. "Jake doesn't do that with most people," he said. "What's he building?" Ethan asked. "We're not entirely sure," Hale said. "He changes the answer every time we ask. We've stopped asking." Dinner was loud and imperfect in the way family dinners always are when they're real. 2 conversations happening at the same time. Jake spilling his water and then arguing that it hadn't been his fault. The 11-year-old, a girl named Rosie, delivering a detailed and slightly alarming account of a conflict at her school that required several adult clarifications before the actual facts emerged. Hale's son-in-law, a quiet man named Dave who worked in civil engineering and appeared to find his family thoroughly entertaining, kept passing dishes to Ethan without being asked, which Ethan appreciated. Sophie ate everything put in front of her and asked Marion for the recipe for the potatoes, which was the highest compliment she gave food. And Marion wrote it down on a post-it note and gave it to her with the gravity of someone bestowing something significant. Hale sat at the head of the table and mostly listened, which Ethan had started to understand was his way. Not withdrawn, just a man who preferred to take things in over contributing to noise. He watched Sophie the way he had at the gala, with that quality of attention that wasn't surveillance but something quieter, like he was storing it. After dinner, when the kids had migrated back to the garage and Dave was doing dishes and Marion had settled into a chair with tea, Hale and Ethan ended up in the small study off the living room, which was book-heavy and slightly dim and smelled like paper and something wooden. Hale poured 2 fingers of something from a bottle on the shelf and handed one to Ethan without asking. Ethan took it. "What is it?" "Old enough to not need a label," Hale said, which was not an answer, but he sat and Ethan sat and they both drank. "The foundation board position," Hale said. "Have you thought more about it?" "I have." "And?" Ethan turned the glass in his hands. "I'm going to say yes." Hale looked at him steadily. "What changed?" "Sophie asked me something a few weeks ago," Ethan said, "about whether I was there for the places that count. And I've been thinking about what counts." He paused. "The advocacy work, the family support component. That counts. That's something I understand from the inside. I've been on that side of it." "You have." "And I'm not going to be useful pretending I don't know what I know," Ethan said. "That's just waste." Hale nodded once. "Claire would have agreed with you." "She would have gotten there faster," Ethan said. "Probably," Hale said without softening it. "But you got there." They sat with that for a moment. From the garage there was a sound that was either a minor mechanical success or a minor mechanical failure. It was hard to tell, followed by Jake's voice at high volume and Sophie's voice at a slightly lower but equally emphatic volume. Hale glanced toward the sound. "They're going to be fine, those two." "She doesn't make friends that quickly usually," Ethan said. "Jake makes friends with people who don't condescend to him," Hale said. "Most people do. Sophie apparently doesn't." Ethan looked at his glass. "She got that from Claire, too." "What did she get from you?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "The stubbornness," he said. "The part where she's wrong, and she knows she's wrong, but she has to take a minute before she can say it out loud." Hale made a sound that was dry and brief and was definitely a laugh. "That's a useful quality," he said. "In the right amounts?" "In the wrong amounts, it's a Tuesday," Ethan said. This time Hale laughed properly, short, real, slightly surprised at itself. The laugh of a man who had forgotten for a moment to be composed. He recovered quickly, but it had happened, and Ethan filed it away as something he hadn't expected to see and was glad to have seen. Olivia arrived late, something about a call that ran long, which she texted about with the slightly frustrated shorthand of someone who had been trying to end a conversation for 40 minutes. She came in through the back door from the kitchen while Ethan and her father were still in the study, and he heard her voice first. That particular directness, even in a casual exchange with Marion, that he'd started to think of as distinctly hers. She appeared in the doorway of the study with her coat still on and her hair slightly disheveled in the way it got when she'd been pushing her hands through it, which he'd noticed she did when she was irritated. "Dad?" she said. "Sorry, the Mercer people again." "We saved you food," Hale said. "Marion already told me." She looked at Ethan. "You made it. I said I would. You said you'd see about the childcare. It worked out." She took off her coat and draped it over the chair near the door and sat in the remaining seat in the study, tucking one foot under her, the way people do when they're finally somewhere they feel like they can stop performing. It was a small thing, that particular loosening that happens when someone is genuinely comfortable, and he noticed it because it was different from the version of her he'd seen at the gala. "How's Sophie?" "In the garage with Jake," Hale said. "She's been there for most of the evening." Olivia looked briefly at the ceiling. "Is Jake's thing still standing?" "Structurally, yes," Hale said. "Conceptually, we remain unclear." "He told me last week it was a catapult," she said. He told me it was a weather station, Hale said. They both looked at Ethan. He told Sophie it was a submarine, Ethan said. A pause. For a garage, Olivia said. He seemed confident about it, Ethan said. She pressed her lips together and her eyes went bright at the corners, and then she laughed, and this time it was fully out. The genuine version, not the almost laugh he'd caught at the gala, but the real thing, open and slightly undignified and completely unguarded. He had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to see that again. The 4 weeks that followed the Sunday dinner were not dramatic. That was the thing about the shift that was happening in Ethan's life. It didn't arrive like a wave. It arrived like the gradual increase of light in early morning, where you can't identify the exact moment things became visible, only that at some point they were. He went back to the Hale house twice more on Sundays. Sophie went from being Jake's building project audience to being an active collaborator, which resulted in the structure being reinforced in 3 new places and losing its identity as a submarine in favor of something Sophie described as a command center, which Jake found acceptable. Ethan accepted the foundation board position formally, signing the paperwork on a Wednesday afternoon at his kitchen table with Sophie doing homework beside him, asking what he was signing, him explaining, her saying, "Good." The way she said things when they made sense to her, and she wanted him to know that without making it a big moment. He went to one board meeting in November and found it uncomfortable in the way new things are uncomfortable, the unfamiliar rhythms of it, not knowing where his voice fit. And went to the next one and felt slightly less out of place and told himself that was the trajectory. The citation arrived by mail on a Thursday. An official envelope with military return address, formal language inside, his name printed at the top. He read it once, folded it, put it in the kitchen drawer. Not face down this time. Just put away. Sophie found it the next morning. "What's this?" she said, holding it up. "Citation," he said. "For service." She unfolded it and read it slowly, sounding out the longer words. He let her read it without commentary. When she finished, she folded it back along the original creases and handed it to him. "This should go somewhere people can see it," she said. "It's fine in the drawer." "Daddy," she gave him the look. "It should go where people can see it." He looked at her. "Where?" She walked to the living room and pointed at the mantel, beside the framed photograph of Claire. The space beside it that had always been slightly empty, the gap he'd never quite filled, the space he'd been unconsciously leaving. "There," she said. He looked at the mantel for a moment. At Claire's photograph, Claire in uniform, the one taken before deployment, her expression doing the thing it did in photos where she was simultaneously serious and just about to smile, caught in the half-second between the two. He went and stood beside Sophie and looked at it. "All right," he said. He got a frame from the hall closet, the kind they used for school papers and drawings, glass-fronted, simple. He folded the citation so it sat clean inside it. He set it on the mantel beside Claire's photograph. Sophie stood beside him and regarded it with the critical eye of someone assessing a wall arrangement. "That's right," she said finally. He agreed that it was. Oops. He and Olivia had dinner alone for the first time on a Friday in late November. Not a date, they hadn't used that word. Just dinner, the way two people who have been circling each other can sometimes meet in a neutral space and not call it what it is until they're ready. A restaurant near her office, not expensive but not casual either, the kind of place where the noise level was low enough for actual conversation. She was already there when he arrived, which he appreciated. He had a low tolerance for sitting at a table alone while the room registered that he was waiting for someone. She ordered fast and without much deliberation, which he found out was her standard. She'd looked at the menu before he arrived because she disliked the performance of studying it at the table. "You look better than the last time I saw you," she said. "That was Sunday dinner. I looked fine." "You look like you were holding something very carefully," she said. "Tonight you don't." He looked at her across the table. "Are you always this observant, or is it just me?" "It's everyone," she said. "I just usually keep it to myself." "Why not with me?" She considered that. "Because you don't react badly to it," she said. "Most people do. They get self-conscious or they get defensive. You just—" She made a small gesture. "Take it." "I worked with people whose lives depended on accurate assessment of situations," he said. "I find precision easier than diplomacy." So do I, she said. It's gotten me into trouble more than once. Same, he said. They ordered. The food came and it was decent without being remarkable, and neither of them were really there for the food anyway, which they both knew. How's the board work? She said. Uncomfortable. Getting less so. That's the arc. Your father said something similar. We agree on most things, she said. Don't tell him I said that. He thinks we argue more than we do. Why does he think that? Because I let him, she said simply. He likes winning arguments. I pick the ones that matter and let him have the rest. Ethan looked at her. That's calculated. It's love, she said. They're the same thing sometimes. He sat with that for a moment. It was the most she'd said about her father directly, about the texture of that relationship, the way she navigated it. It landed differently than he expected, because it was honest in the same way his own most honest things were honest. Slightly unguarded, not prepared. The kind of admission that comes out when someone is comfortable enough to stop editing themselves. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes? The gala. When you stepped in at the door, what was actually going through your head? She looked at him for a moment, turned her fork in her hand. Honestly? Please. I was angry, she said, not at you, at the situation, at the specific particular stupidity of a room full of people watching a veteran with a child being questioned over a system error and doing nothing. She set the fork down. I've seen my father carry what he carries for years, the weight of a debt he couldn't find the face to attach to. I knew your name because he'd said it. Well, he didn't have your name for a long time. He just said a soldier, a young one. But I'd grown up with that story like a room in the house, like a place that always existed even if you didn't go into it every day. She looked at him directly. And then you were standing right there, with your daughter, being treated like you didn't belong in a room you had more right to be in than anyone. He was quiet. So I wasn't calculating anything, she said. I wasn't going to not do it, that's all. That's not a small thing, he said. It wasn't a hard call, she said. Those are usually the most important ones, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something shifted slightly in her expression, a recalibration, like she was updating something. Your wife said that, she said. Not a question. He blinked. How did you... My father quoted her once, she said. He'd heard her say something like it. He remembered it because it was the kind of thing you remember. She paused. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... No, he said. It's all right. He picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking. She did say that, variations of it. She believed the hard calls were the ones that didn't feel like choices, that if it felt like a choice, you were already partway wrong. Smart woman, Olivia said. She was the smartest person I knew, he said, and she knew it, which, on a bad day, could be a lot. Something moved at the corner of Olivia's mouth. That's the most human thing you've said about her, she said. He looked at his plate. I try to be careful about how I talk about her in front of people who didn't know her. It's easy to... He paused. She was real. She was a real person. She wasn't a saint. She was stubborn, and she was certain about things before the evidence arrived. And she folded laundry wrong, and she had a temper when she was tired, and she didn't always apologize for it. He looked up. And she was also the bravest, most honest person I ever met. Both things. They're not contradictory, Olivia said. No, he said. But it took me a while to learn how to say both at the same time without feeling like I was failing her somehow. Olivia looked at him steadily. You're not failing her, she said. You're describing her. That's different. The conversation moved after that. Easier, less weighted. The way conversations move when the heavier things have been laid on the table and don't need to be avoided anymore. He found out she'd almost not taken over her own company, had nearly sold it to a larger firm in year 3 when the losses were outpacing the growth, and she'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for 18 months. He told her about the first year after Claire, the way the logistics of grief had been almost a relief. The arrangements and the paperwork and the practicalities of caring for an infant alone, because as long as there was something concrete to manage, he didn't have to look directly at what was under it. Busyness as avoidance, she said. Busyness as survival. he said. At the time. Yeah, she said. I understand that. They closed the restaurant out, which neither of them had planned, and both of them noticed only when the staff began their quiet work around the tables. Outside on the sidewalk, it was cold. Properly cold now, the November kind that gets into the collar of your coat. She was pulling her jacket closed, and he was doing the same, and they stood on the sidewalk in the amber light of the street. Sophie's with your neighbor? She said. Mrs. Aldridge, yeah. How late can you be? 11:30, maybe midnight if I text. She looked at him for a moment, something clear and direct in her eyes, and then she said, Walk with me for a bit? He looked at her. At the sidewalk ahead of them, empty and lit. Yeah, he said. All right. They walked. Not toward anything specific, just through the city's nighttime version of itself, the restaurants still lit and the later bars just starting to fill. The cold air doing what cold air does in cities, pushing everything slightly closer together. They didn't hold hands. They walked close, their steps falling into the same rhythm, the way steps will when two people are paying attention to each other without making it a point of concentration. She told him about a thing that had gone wrong at work that week, a decision she'd made that she was second-guessing, and he listened without trying to fix it, just tracking it, and offered one observation when she seemed to actually want one, rather than just to say it out loud. She seemed to register the difference, which he found out later she had, that she'd noticed he didn't reflexively solution find, which was a quality she encountered rarely in her professional life, and less rarely than she'd like in her personal one. He told her something about Sophie, a small thing, Sophie correcting him in front of Mrs. Aldridge about the proper way to fold fitted sheets, with complete authority, despite never having folded a fitted sheet in her life. It was a minor story, domestic and not dramatic, the kind of story you tell when you're with someone and you want them to know the small texture of your life. Olivia laughed, the real one, again, and said, She definitely got that from Claire. She absolutely did, he agreed. They walked until they were back somewhere close to where they'd started, on the block with the restaurant, and they stood on the corner under the amber light, and the city moved around them doing what cities do. This was good, she said. It was, he said. She looked at him with that directness, the particular clear-eyed directness that had been present the night at the gala, and hadn't left. That was, he'd come to understand, just her, the consistent quality of her attention. I'm going to kiss you, she said, if that's all right. He looked at her. His chest did something complicated. Yeah, he said. That's all right. She did. Brief, honest, not dramatic. The kind of kiss that doesn't try to be more than it is, but doesn't pretend to be less either. The kind that is simply what it is. Two people, a cold street, a beginning of something. She pulled back. They were close in the amber light and the cold. I'm not easy, she said. Her own words, from the phone call, returning them. I know, he said. I'm not either. We've established that. Yeah. He looked at her. I think we can work with it. She nodded, once, like the matter was settled. Her breath made small clouds in the cold. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night, he said. He walked back to his truck and sat in it for a minute before starting the engine, looking at the street ahead. He thought about Claire's letter, what she'd said about living, about not making the invisibility permanent, about letting things be real again. He started the truck. It made its usual noise at cold starts. He pulled out into the street and drove home through the November dark. And when he got back to the apartment and paid Mrs. Aldridge and checked on Sophie, who was asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, in her usual sleeping chaos, he stood in her doorway and felt the particular quality of that moment. Quiet, small, the apartment around him and his daughter breathing in the next room and the city outside going about its business. And understood that what he was feeling, standing there in the doorway in his coat, was something he hadn't quite felt in a very long time. Not fixed, not finished, not any of the clean words, just present. Here, in his own life. He turned off the hallway light and went to bed. December came in quietly that year, the way it sometimes does in cities, not with a sharp drop or a dramatic shift, just a gradual deepening of the cold, until one morning you wake up and realize that summer is genuinely gone, and you've stopped expecting it to come back. Ethan noticed it on a Tuesday, driving Sophie to school, when the windshield fogged from the inside and she drew a face on it with her finger before he could turn the defroster all the way up. Just a circle and two eyes and a lopsided smile. There and gone in 60 seconds as the glass cleared. She didn't say anything about it, just drew it and went back to looking out the window. That was Sophie at 7, almost 8, doing small, unconscious things that accumulated into a person he was still in the process of knowing. He thought about that drawing for most of his shift that morning. The board meetings had settled into something manageable by December. His third one was easier than his second had been, and his second had been easier than his first, which was the only arc he could have honestly hoped for. He'd found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had things to say in those rooms, not from policy knowledge or institutional experience, but from the specific, unglamorous understanding of what it looked like to come home from service and find that the structure you'd relied on had no civilian equivalent. The other board members were mostly older, mostly decorated, mostly accustomed to talking in the vocabulary of institutional frameworks, and Ethan spoke differently than they did, more plainly, with less ceremony. And that plainness had turned out to be the thing the room occasionally needed. Richard Hale, who sat at the end of the table during board meetings with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, had said nothing about it directly. But after the third meeting, walking to the parking lot, he'd fallen into step beside Ethan and said, "You said the right thing in there, about the transition support gap." "I said the obvious thing," Ethan said. "Obvious things need saying in rooms where everyone is too invested in the non-obvious to see clearly," Hale said. Ethan looked at him sideways. "Was that a compliment?" "Take it however you want," Hale said, which was as close to a yes as the old man generally got. The thing with Olivia moved the way it moved, which was not fast and not perfectly, and not without its complications, because nothing real moves that way, and both of them were old enough and had been through enough to distrust anything that arrived too easily. There was a week in early December where they didn't speak much, both of them occupied. Her with a product launch that had gone sideways in a way that required 70-hour weeks to correct. Him with a stretch of back-to-back maintenance calls at the warehouse that ate his evenings. They texted in the abbreviated, slightly tired way of people whose bandwidth has been temporarily consumed by necessity, and there was a Wednesday night where they'd planned to talk and both fell asleep before 10 o'clock, and he woke up at midnight to a text that said simply, "Fell asleep. Tomorrow?" And he sent it back tomorrow, and they both seemed to understand that this was fine, that whatever this was could accommodate a week of being too tired, that it didn't need constant attention to remain real. That understanding, that particular low-maintenance trust, was something he hadn't expected to find this quickly. He didn't say that to her, but he held it. Sophie had opinions. Of course Sophie had opinions. She was 7, and she processed the world primarily through opinions, stated directly and without much filtering. She'd met Olivia twice more by December. Once at a Sunday dinner at Hale's house, where Olivia had arrived on time and brought a dessert that Jake ate most of before anyone else got to it. And once when Olivia had stopped by Ethan's apartment on a Saturday afternoon to drop off a book Hale had wanted Ethan to read. Sophie had been at the kitchen table when Olivia came in, working on a drawing, and had looked up and said without preamble, "Are you my dad's girlfriend?" Ethan had been in the kitchen doorway and had felt the back of his neck heat up. Olivia had looked at Sophie with that direct, uncalibrated attention and said, "We're still figuring that out." Sophie had processed this. "How long does figuring out take?" "Depends on the people," Olivia said. "How long for you two?" "Sophie," Ethan said. "I'm asking," Sophie said. "I don't know," Olivia said, honestly, "but I'm not in a hurry." Sophie seemed to find this acceptable. She looked back at her drawing. "Okay," she said. "Do you want to see what I'm making?" "Yeah," Olivia said. "I really do." She sat at the kitchen table with Sophie for 20 minutes while Ethan stood in the doorway, watching his daughter explain her drawing in the detailed, circuitous way she explained things, and watching Olivia listen, actually listen, not the polite performance of listening, but the thing itself, asking questions that proved she'd tracked what Sophie said 2 sentences ago. After Olivia left, Sophie had looked at Ethan and said, "She's good at listening." "She is," Ethan agreed. "Not everyone is." Sophie said, with the wisdom of someone who had been underestimated by adults often enough to have developed a taxonomy of how people paid attention. No, he said. Not everyone is. Sophie went back to her drawing. Ethan stood there a moment longer, and then he went to make dinner. The second annual foundation ceremony was not a gala. It was smaller, a daytime event, a December memorial observance held at the foundation's main building, low-key compared to the Alderman Grand evening, more attended by families than by decorated guests. Ethan had been asked by the board chair to say a few words as the foundation's newest advisory member, which he'd agreed to with some reluctance and had then spent 2 weeks regretting. He was not afraid of rooms. He had been in rooms with considerably higher stakes than a memorial observance. But speaking at something like this, at a microphone in front of people who were carrying their own versions of what he carried, that was different. That asked for something more exposed than professional competence. He'd written and discarded 4 versions of what he wanted to say. On the night before the ceremony, he was at the kitchen table at 10:30, a mostly blank page in front of him, when Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair loose, holding the small silver pendant she always took off before bed. "Why are you still up?" he said. "I heard you moving around," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not," she said, sitting down across from him with the directness that was increasingly Claire. "You're doing the thing where you make noise when you're worried." He looked at her. "What thing?" "You pace," she said. "In the kitchen. Back and forth, back and forth." She demonstrated with 2 fingers on the table. He hadn't known she'd noticed that. "I have to speak tomorrow," he said. "At the foundation thing." "I know," she said. I'm coming." "I know you're coming." "So what do you have to say?" He looked at his blank page. "I don't know yet." Sophie leaned forward on her elbows and looked at the page seriously. She thought about it. She turned the pendant over in her fingers, the little silver C catching the kitchen light. "Say what's true," she said. "It needs to be more than that." "Why?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. "Mom used to say that when you say the true thing, people feel it even if you don't say it perfectly," Sophie said. "She said that to me once when I had to do a presentation at school, and I kept trying to make it fancy." She turned the pendant over again. "She said the fancy usually gets in the way." He looked at his daughter at 10:30 at night, in her pajamas with her hair loose, casually delivering a piece of wisdom her mother had given her that her mother had probably not known she was storing for future deployment. "When did she say that to you?" he said. "You were 4 when—" "I was 5, Sophie said. "The October before she died. I had a show and tell, and I was trying to make it sound like the big kids." She shrugged slightly, in a way that was not quite indifferent, more like someone who has made peace with a complicated thing and carries it lightly now. "She said, be yourself, the fancy gets in the way." He sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, I know what to say." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Good." She stood up. "I'm going back to bed." "Thank you," he said. She paused in the doorway, her back to him. "You're good at the true thing, Daddy," she said. "You just forget sometimes." Then she went to bed, and he sat at the table. And he wrote 1 page plainly, without the fancy, and it took him 20 minutes, and it was the right thing. The ceremony was held in the foundation's main hall, which was large enough for a few hundred people, and on this December morning held close to that. Families of fallen soldiers, veterans in and out of uniform, foundation staff, board members, and a scattering of people who came every year because they needed somewhere to go in December when the weight of absence got specific. Sophie sat in the front row between Olivia and Marion, who had come with Hale and had immediately taken on the project of making sure Sophie had water and something to eat, which Sophie accepted with the gracious pragmatism of a child who recognizes competent caretaking when she sees it. Ethan stood at the side of the room before his turn, watching the earlier speakers, holding his 1 page folded in his jacket pocket. He didn't look at it. He'd written it. It was in him now. Hale appeared at his shoulder. "You'll be fine," he said. "I know," Ethan said. Hale looked at him for a moment. "You nervous?" "Yes." "Good," Hale said. "You should be. It means you understand what you're about to do." He was called up after the 3rd speaker, introduced by the board chair with a brief summary, new advisory member, veteran, family of a fallen soldier, and he walked to the microphone and looked out at the room. He found Sophie immediately. She was watching him with her hands in her lap and the pendant visible at her collar and her expression steady, the serious face she put on for things that mattered. And beside her, Olivia was watching him in that particular way she had, clear, direct, without performance. He unfolded his page, looked at it once, and put it back in his pocket. "I didn't want to come to the gala in October," he said. "I want to start there, because I think it's honest, and I think honest is the only thing worth saying in a room like this." The room was quiet. I hadn't been to a foundation event in 4 years. I told myself it was because I'd moved on, because my life was in a different place, because I'd built something new and I needed to protect it. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He paused. The whole truth is that I was afraid. Not of rooms like this, I'd been in worse rooms, but of what being in a room like this would cost me, of remembering things I'd gotten good at not looking at directly, of having to stand somewhere and be seen as a person whose wife died, and whose life had a hole in it, instead of just as someone getting through his days. He looked at the room. My daughter made me come. Not explicitly. She didn't know she was doing it, but she had questions she needed answers to, about who her mother was, about what her mother stood for, and I had promised. And when it's your kid asking, the answers to why not stop being enough. A few people in the room shifted. A woman in the third row pressed her hand over her mouth briefly. "I got humiliated at the door," he said. And that turned into a thing in the room because that's how these things go. And people found out who I was, more than I wanted, more than I'd offered. And I stood there and let them know because my daughter was watching and I was not going to teach her to disappear. He stopped. "I don't have a lesson in a box," he said. I don't have a clean ending. What I have is this. I came in from 4 years of being alone with my grief and my kid and my walls, and I was seen by people who had earned the right to see me, who understood what they were looking at, and that seeing turned out to be the thing I hadn't known I was starving for. He looked down for a moment. "We talk a lot about service and sacrifice. We talk about honoring the fallen, and all of that is right and necessary. But the people still standing, the ones who drove home from every deployment, who went back to civilian life and tried to build something in the shape of what they'd lost, those people need to be seen too. Not praised, not made into stories, just seen, acknowledged, allowed back into a community that understands what they carried." He looked at Sophie. She was sitting very straight, the way she had at the gala when Claire's name was read, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. She was receiving it, the same way she had received her mother's name on the wall, with that particular combination of grief and pride that was already, at 7 years old, distinctively hers. "My wife, Corporal Claire Carter, was the bravest person I ever knew," he said. "Not because she was without fear. She was afraid plenty, she told me so, because she acted anyway, and she acted honestly, and she never once made the people around her feel small so she could feel larger." He paused. "She left my daughter a keepsake and a letter. She left me a letter that told me to stop hiding. She did this from a hospital bed while she was dying, which is the most Claire thing she ever did, because she was always thinking 3 steps ahead of where you thought she was." Something moved in his voice. He let it. "I'm still learning to live up to what she asked me to do. Some days I'm better at it than others. But I'm here. We're here." He looked at Sophie again. "That's what she wanted. For us to be here, in the room, instead of outside of it." He stepped back from the microphone. The room was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet that means something landed, that it found the people it was looking for. And then the applause came. Not the polished, reflexive kind, but the real kind. The kind that has weight. He walked back to his seat. Sophie moved immediately, slid out of her chair, came to him before he'd sat, put her arms around him the way she had that night at the kitchen table when they'd read the letters. He held her in the aisle, in front of everybody, and didn't care about anybody watching. Olivia, when he finally sat, didn't say anything. She put her hand on his forearm and left it there. And that was the right thing, the only thing, and he was grateful she understood that. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the adjoining hall. Coffee, food, the slow mingling of people who had just shared something. Ethan moved through it with Sophie beside him and Olivia on his other side, and people came to speak to him, not with the slightly stunned quality of the Gala crowd, who had been reassembling their understanding of him in real time, but quietly, purposefully. A woman who had lost her brother 2 years ago and hadn't been back to a foundation event since. A veteran in his 50s who shook Ethan's hand for a long time and said, "I needed to hear the part about still standing," and then moved on without elaborating, which was enough, which was more than enough. A man he didn't recognize approached with a boy of about 12 and said, "My son wanted to meet you." And the boy looked at Ethan with the serious, slightly overwhelmed expression of a kid who has been brought somewhere that matters and knows it and is trying to handle that correctly. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that was trying very hard to be adult. "My dad talks about Corporal Carter," the boy said. "He served with her." Ethan looked at him. "What's your dad's name?" "Sergeant Marcus Webb," the man beside him said. He had service in his posture even in civilian clothes, the way some people carry it permanently. "We weren't close, different units toward the end, but she pulled me out of a vehicle situation in the second year." He paused. "I heard you speak. I wanted you to know she had more people she'd touched than you might have been told." Ethan looked at him. The accumulation of it, all the stories, all the people Claire had moved through and affected, the specific practical ways she had changed the arithmetic of who got to survive, hit him in a different place than it usually did. Not grief, exactly. Something more like awe, like finally understanding the scale of a thing he'd only ever known from the inside. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I should have found you sooner," Webb said. "You found me," Ethan said. "That's what matters." Sophie had been listening. She looked at the 12-year-old boy and said, "My mom helped your dad?" The boy looked at her. "Yeah." Sophie processed this in the way she processed important things, fully, without rushing it. Then she said, "So she helped 2 families." She looked at Webb, then at the boy. "Ours and yours." Webb's jaw tightened in the way jaws tighten when you're holding something in. "She helped more than 2, he said. Sophie considered that. "That's a lot," she said, and Ethan heard the echo of what she'd said to Richard Hale in that side room at the Gala. That's a lot of people. And understood that she was building something his daughter had been building it since October, assembling the pieces of who her mother was from every person who came forward with a part of the story, that she was making something whole out of what had only ever been fragments. He put his hand on Sophie's shoulder. She leaned into it, and the pendant caught the light at her collar, and Webb looked at it and then looked away quickly. Hale found them near the end of the reception, when the crowd had thinned and the coffee had gone from hot to lukewarm, and Sophie was sitting with Marion eating a cookie and telling her, in complete seriousness, about a book she'd read at the school book fair last week. Ethan had made it to the book fair. He'd covered the shift. Sophie had picked 3 books and hadn't said anything about it afterward except to show him the books, which was more than enough. "Good speech," Hale said. "It was 1 page," Ethan said. "Some of the best things are," Hale said. They stood side by side, both of them watching the room, the remaining clusters of people, the staff beginning the quiet work of clearing. "I've been thinking," Hale said, "about what you said, about being seen, about the people still standing, and I've been doing this work for 20 years, Hale said, and I think I've been doing the honors part more than the living part, the ceremonies, the citations, the programs." He stopped. "What you said up there reminded me that the living part is the work, the day-to-day of it, the showing up." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have found you 4 years ago. I want you to know I understand that." "You found me when I was ready," Ethan said. "You don't have to let me off the hook." "I'm not," Ethan said. "I mean it literally. I wasn't ready 4 years ago. I wouldn't have been able to be here 4 years ago. The timing was what it was." Hale turned and looked at him in that measuring way that Ethan had gotten used to and no longer found pressurizing. "You're more forgiving than I expected." "I'm trying to be," Ethan said. "It doesn't come naturally. I work at it." Hale nodded once. Something in the set of his face shifted. The slight, almost imperceptible relaxation of a man who has been carrying a long-held account of his own failures and has just been carefully relieved of some portion of it. Olivia is serious, Hale said. Not a question, not preamble, just a fact being stated in a way that invited confirmation. I know, Ethan said. She doesn't do things by half, Hale said. Historically, that's gotten her hurt. I know that too, Ethan said. I'm not going to hurt her. I didn't think you were, Hale said. I'm telling you because she won't tell you herself. She'll show you, eventually, but she won't say it. Noted, Ethan said. Hale put out his hand. Ethan shook it, the same long, two-handed grip as the night at the gala, but different now because now it was between two people who knew each other, even a little, and the knowing made the gesture mean something it couldn't have meant in October. Thank you, Hale said, for all of it, the mission, tonight, for raising that child. Thank you for finding us, Ethan said. They drove home in the late afternoon, Ethan and Sophie, through the December city with its holiday lights beginning to come on in windows and storefronts. Sophie was in the back seat, the 3 books from the book fair in her lap, looking out the window at the lights. Daddy, she said. Yeah. At the ceremony, when you talked about Mom. She paused. You weren't sad. He thought about that. I was a little sad. But not like before, she said. Before you were sad in a way that made everything quiet. Like the whole house got quieter when you were sad about her. He watched the road. I know. It's different now, she said. You're still sad sometimes, but it's not the quiet kind. He didn't answer for a moment. He wasn't sure he had the words for what she was describing, that specific quality of grief in the first years, when it had been so present that it displaced air, made rooms smaller, made him smaller in ways he hadn't known she'd noticed. I think, he said carefully, that the sad doesn't go away, but it changes shape. It gets lighter to carry, not because it matters less, because you figure out how to hold it without it being the only thing you're holding. Sophie thought about this. Like how I learned to carry my backpack and my lunchbox at the same time, she said. He looked at her in the rear-view mirror. Yeah, he said. Exactly like that. She seemed satisfied. She looked back at the lights passing outside her window. I like Olivia, she said. I know you do. She listens, Sophie said. She does. And she's not trying too hard, Sophie said. Some adults try too hard with kids. It's annoying. She doesn't do that. She's pretty straightforward, Ethan agreed. She's like you, Sophie said, but less stubborn. He almost choked on that. I'm not sure she'd agree with the less stubborn part. I'm 7, Sophie said. I can only compare to what I know. He smiled at the road ahead. They stopped at a red light, and in the window of the building on the corner, someone had strung lights in the shape of something that was either a star or a snowflake. It was hard to tell from the angle. It might have been both. It might have been neither. Sophie pressed her face against her window, looking up at it. The pendant swung slightly at her collar with the movement. Daddy, she said. Yeah. Do you think she knows about all the people, about all the families? He looked at the lights on the corner. The question was the same one Sophie had asked in the memorial gallery in October. Does she know we came? And he had not answered it well then, had given her the honest but incomplete answer, the one about why the coming mattered regardless. He had learned more since then. He had more to work with. I think, he said slowly, that the things she did are still happening. Those men she pulled out, they went home, and their kids grew up, and their grandkids are going to grow up, and all of it is connected to something she did. That doesn't stop existing. It keeps going. He paused. I don't know what she knows, but I know what she left, and what she left keeps going. Sophie pulled her face from the window. She looked at him in the mirror. Like the letter, she said. Like the letter, he said. Like you. Like all of it. She sat back in her seat. She held the pendant in her fingers for a moment, the way she did when she was thinking something through, and then she let it go and picked up the top book from her stack and opened it in her lap. The light changed. He drove. That night, after Sophie was in bed, legitimately asleep this time, not the strategic performance of sleep she sometimes deployed, Ethan sat on the couch in the quiet apartment and did something he hadn't done in years. He just sat. No phone, no television, nothing to manage. Just the quiet and the lamp in the corner and the mantel across the room with Claire's photograph and the framed citation side by side. He looked at them for a while. He had come a long way from October. Not in distance. His life was in the same city, the same apartment, the same truck with the same noise at cold starts. But in something less measurable and more essential. He had been, in October, a man who had built his life around minimizing exposure, around the management of the gap, around the particular unconscious logic of someone who has lost something enormous and decided, without quite deciding it, that the safest response is to keep everything small. Sophie had called it the quiet kind of sad, the kind that made rooms smaller. He didn't think the rooms were smaller anymore. He thought about what he'd said at the ceremony, about being seen, about the people still standing. He'd meant every word of it, but sitting here now in the quiet, he understood that the person he'd been talking to, at some level, had been himself. The version of himself who'd stood outside this community for 4 years and told himself it was by choice. The version who'd kept the invitation on the counter for 11 days because he wasn't sure he was allowed back in. You were always allowed back in. That was the thing nobody had told him, or maybe they'd tried and he hadn't been ready to hear it. There was no permission required to stop hiding. There was no moment at which the grief was officially complete enough to allow you to return to your own life. You just had to turn toward it. You just had to carry the sad the way Sophie described, along with the other things, not instead of them. He was not finished missing Claire. He was going to miss her for the rest of his life, in varying intensity and in the particular shape of her absence. The things she'd never see Sophie do, the conversations they'd never have, the accumulated ordinary losses of a life that was supposed to be shared. That was real, and it was permanent, and he was no longer afraid of it. What he was now was also something else. Present, connected. In possession of a community, a daughter who was going to be an astonishing person, and the early, complicated, real-thing beginnings of something with a woman who listened and didn't push and understood that some processes had to arrive at their own pace. He had come to the gala to honor a promise, and he had left with more than he'd gone in for. That was not nothing. That was in fact the whole of it. He reached over to the end table and picked up his phone, typed a text to Olivia. "Good day today. Thank you for being there." He set the phone down. Her reply came 3 minutes later. "You did the hard part. I just sat next to you." He looked at that for a moment. Then, that was the part that mattered. A longer pause. Then, "Get some sleep, Ethan." He smiled at his phone in the quiet apartment. Then he set it down and leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. He thought about Claire, not the grief shape of her, not the loss, but the actual person. The way she folded laundry wrong and was certain about things before the evidence arrived and made every room feel inhabited the moment she walked into it. The way she'd looked at him in the early years, with that particular combination of exasperation and love that said, "I see exactly who you are, and I'm here anyway." The way she'd written his name on an envelope from a hospital bed and trusted that it would find him when he needed it. He thought about what she'd asked of him. "Let people in. Live. It's not a betrayal. It's what I want for you." He was doing that, slowly, imperfectly, in the specific human way of a man who was still learning to carry the backpack and the lunchbox at the same time. But he was doing it. He fell asleep on the couch, which was not what he'd planned, and woke briefly around 2 in the morning to turn off the lamp, and saw Sophie's door cracked open the way it always was, the night light casting its small, warm square onto the hallway floor. He stood there for a moment in the dark, in his own apartment, in his own life. The rooms were not smaller. The rooms were just rooms, the right size, lit from within, full of the particular evidence of 2 people living in them. The homework on the table, and the shoes by the door, and the 3 books from the book fair stacked on the kitchen counter, and the citation on the mantel, and the photograph beside it. Everything that had broken, everything that had been rebuilt from what remained, everything that was still, slowly, being built. He went to bed. Outside, the city went about its December business, indifferent and continuous. The lights in the windows came on and went off. The cold did what cold does. Somewhere across town, a man who had survived because of a soldier's choice was sleeping in his own house, and his grandchildren were sleeping in their rooms. And the chain of that fact extended forward into a future nobody could see yet, the way all real things extend. Not cleanly, not without cost, but honestly and without end. There are people who leave marks on the world by standing at the center of it, making noise, demanding to be accounted for. And there are people who leave marks by doing the thing in front of them, quietly, because it was the thing that needed doing, and then going home and living and trusting that the mark will hold without their tending it. Claire Carter was the second kind. So, slowly and imperfectly, was the man she loved. So, in her own small, fierce way, was the daughter they had made together, who slept now with one arm thrown over the edge of her mattress and a silver pendant on the nightstand beside her. Already more herself than either of her parents had been at her age, already carrying more than she should have had to carry, and carrying it anyway, and carrying it well. That was the story. Not the gala, not the citation, not the long arc of recognition finally arriving after years of delay. The story was the Tuesday mornings and the school book fairs and the subtraction worksheets and the conversations in parked trucks and the drawings on fogged glass. The story was the work of staying present in your own life when loss had taught you to stand just outside of it. The story was, he came back, and the door was open, and he walked through it.